or GAGs. So that's for today. So this is an extra class to make up for the previous class, which was kind of, postponed or because of connectivity issue. Anyway, so introducing you to the core features of Oracle. Here at Oracle, we have live classes, recorded classes, notes and MCQs all curated as per your needs based on the latest CBME syllabus to enhance your knowledge and cater to all your needs. Then apart from that, we have personalized counseling sessions. This is more like a therapy session where you can talk to our counselors. So feel free to book a slot with us anytime if you want any extra support or counseling or therapy from our end. So we're here to help you with all sorts of non-academic support as well, apart from providing the academic support, which we already are doing. Then we have three different subscription plans. That is starting from basic, which is for 3 months and will cost you 15,000. Then the standard, which is for 6 months and it comes at 30,000. And the mentorship plan, where we have one-to-one personalized guidance, and it is for 12 months and it can be taken at 50,000. And by using my promo code as displayed on the screen here, you can get additional 20% off. Then talking about the internal exam marathon, this series has been specifically oriented or curated to target to your university exams as you're approaching. So this is a rapid revision series of all important topics. Then we will be covering volatile packs. Multiple choice questions will also be dealt so that your grades can be improved in the exams. Okay. A quick recapitulation of what we've already done in the carbohydrates series. We had done all these cycles, okay? So all the cycles were taken in the initial two classes, and that is what the major important chunk of carbohydrate is: your glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis, TCA, HMP. All of these cycles are very important, okay? There is equal probability of any of these cycles being asked. Then Rappaport, Luberin, Cories, these are also important. Then sometimes you get questions from fructose and galactose metabolism, basically clinical questions, okay? Like on fructose intolerance or galactosemia. Then we have spoken about chemistry of carbohydrates. This is basically more from your practical point of views. For your table vivas and all, you get questions from here in your vivas. Okay, and today we'll be talking about isomerism and GAGs. So without wasting much time, let's start. Is my screen visible? Okay. Isomerism in carbohydrates. Now, there are two types of isomerism: structural isomerism, which is also known as stereoisomerism, and optical isomerism. Now, in structural isomerism, there is same molecular formula, but the structure will be changing. So, there are different structures for a compound, but it still have the same molecular formula. And optical isomerism is based on difference in rotation of plane polarized light, at how the compounds are rotating the plane polarized right differently. Like some will rotate it in right direction, some will rotate in left direction. Okay. Now let's talk about asymmetric carbon atom, or also known as chiral carbon. Okay, so we all know that carbon, it has four valencies. Now, when the four valencies of carbon, they are satisfied by four different groups, then we say that it is a chiral carbon or an asymmetric carbon. Okay, so when the, like, this is your carbon, and we all know that carbon has four valencies. That is, four groups can be attached to it. Now, when all these four groups attached to carbon, they are different. Like A, B, C, D. Four different groups are attached to this carbon. So we say this is an asymmetric or chiral carbon. Okay. Now this is the linear structure of glucose. Now the linear structure or the straight chain structure of glucose, it says it has 4 asymmetric carbon atoms, that is carbon 2, 3, 4 and 5. Let's have a look here at the structure. See, this is carbon 1. Carbon 1 is not an asymmetric carbon because you can see this double bonded oxygen, okay? So two of the valencies are satisfied by this double bonded oxygen. So four different groups now cannot be attached. So this is not an asymmetric carbon. Now carbon 2, this is carbon 2. As you can see here, this carbon 2, this is a chiral carbon. You can see different groups attached. This is one group attached. This is the other group, second group. This is the third group. And this is the fourth group. So your second carbon is a chiral carbon. Similarly, your third carbon is a chiral carbon. Your fourth carbon is a chiral carbon. Your fifth carbon is a chiral carbon. So you have 1, 2, 3, and 4 asymmetric carbon atoms, which are 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can see 2, 3, 4, and 5. They have 4 different groups attached, so they are chiral carbons. But this carbon, carbon 6, as you can see, 2 hydrogen atoms are there. 2 hydrogen atoms, okay? So now the condition of 4 different groups being attached to carbon, that will not be satisfied. So this again, carbon 6 is not a chiral carbon. But talking about the ring structure of glucose, that is glucose existing in the form of a ring, glucopyranose. Here it has 5 asymmetric carbon atoms, okay? 2, 3, 4 and 5, they are common, but what is new? Carbon 1 is also asymmetric. Let's have a look how. This is your carbon 1. Okay, so one group attached is this. This is the second group attached. This is the third group attached. And this is the fourth group attached. So you have 4 different groups attached. So the ring form has 5 asymmetric carbon atoms, whereas the straight chain form of glucose, it only has 4 asymmetric carbon atoms because of the difference of carbon 1. Now, 99% of glucose in solution exists in ring form. We all know that glucose, 99% of glucose in solution exists in solution form, and in solution we know that glucose exists in ring form. So indirectly or directly we say that 99% of glucose is existing in ring form. Now let's talk about fructose. Similarly, in fructose, the open chain structure, it has 3 asymmetric carbon atoms, which are carbon 3, 4, and 5. Carbon 3, 4, and 5. That is this one, 3, 4, and 5. These are asymmetric carbon atoms. Okay, carbon 2 will not be asymmetric because you can see there is a double bonded oxygen. Carbon 1 will not be asymmetric because you can see there are 2 hydrogen atoms attached. Similarly, carbon 6 is not asymmetric because you can see there are 2 hydrogens attached here at carbon 6 also. Talking about the ring structure, your carbon 2, that is the functional carbon in ring structure, is asymmetric, just like in glucose. This is your carbon 2. This is asymmetric. It has 4 different groups. This is one group. This is the second group. This is the third group. And this forms the fourth group. So your fructose in ring form, it has 4 asymmetric carbon atoms, which is carbon 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Now let's talk about Label-Van 't Hoff rule. It says that if you know the number of asymmetric carbon atoms or the chiral carbon, you can calculate the number of possible structural isomers. So the formula for the number of possible structural isomers is 2 to the power n, where n is the number of asymmetric of chiral carbons. So, for example, if there is an MCQ which states or asks how many structural isomers are possible for glucose, okay, it says the question is number of possible structural isomers for glucose. And your options are 16, 32, 8, and 4. So quickly tell me in the comments what will be your answer. 16, 32, 8 or 4. So what will you do? You will apply this formula that I've just given you. That is 2 to the power n. But now the question arises, you must be thinking that you should take this n according to straight chain or according to ring structure. Because in straight chain there are only 4 asymmetrical carbon atoms and in ring there are 5. And you can see in the options, if you multiply 2 into 4 times, 2 to the 4, 4 to the 8, 2 to the 16, you end up with 16. Now, if you multiply 2 5 times, you end up with 32. So in case of ring structure, you have 32 possible isomers. And in case of straight chain, you have 16 possible isomers. Now, the doubt is, the confusion is whether you should mark 16 or 32. So if the option has both 16 and 32, your answer will be 32 because I just told you that 99% of glucose exists in solution form and in solution glucose exists in ring form. So 99% of glucose is existing in ring form. So that is the major form in which glucose exists. So your answer will be 32. But now in case this option was not available, 32 was not there, and let's suppose there was this option 10. Now, when you don't have 32, then your answer becomes 16. Okay. So sometimes, you have to mark your answers depending upon the options available. Okay. Now, moving on to the structural isomers of monosaccharides. So the different types are D and L isomerism, anomerism, and epimers. So let's talk about D and L isomerism, that is also known as enantiomers. D and L isomers are also known as enantiomers. So the difference in orientation of H and OH groups in the penultimate carbon atom or the reference carbon atom. Okay, so it says that there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen, but it is saying in the penultimate or the reference carbon atom, although we will see that this is not true. There is difference even in carbon, rest of the carbons like 2, 3, 4 as well. But it is only for definition's sake that we say penultimate carbon, though there is difference in orientation of H and OH in C2, C3, C4 also. Now, why is it so? The reason for this is because we all know about the parent carbohydrate, that is glyceraldehyde. Okay, so your glyceraldehyde, it is considered as the parent carbohydrate. Okay, the structure is already given. Yeah. So this is your glyceraldehyde and this is the parent. It is considered as the parent carbohydrate. Now this glyceraldehyde only has 3 carbons, as you can see. Carbon 1, carbon 2 and carbon 3. And this carbon 2 is referred to as reference carbon or penultimate carbon. So it was because of this reason that in definition, we say because of reference carbon, there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen in reference or the penultimate carbon because the glyceraldehyde is considered as the parent carbohydrate and it only has reference carbon. Okay. Although, but if we see in other carbohydrate structure which have more than 3 carbons, there is difference in orientation in other carbons as well. Like you can see, this is considered as reference carbon, that is C5. Okay, your C5 is considered as reference carbon or penultimate carbon. But you can see there is orientation difference even in carbon 4, even in carbon 3, and even in carbon 2. So although there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen in carbon 2, 3, 4 as well, but for definition or in definition, we just say that there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen in reference carbon. Okay, now moving on to aneurysm. And also one more thing, that these enantiomers, these are mirror images of each other. Okay. Now talking about aneurysm, this is isomerism and functional carbon. So in aldoses which have aldehyde functional group, aldehyde is attached at carbon 1 position 1. So the functional carbon is C1. So in aldoses, when there is isomerism at C1, or in ketoses, when there is isomerism at C2, it is known as aneurysm. Examples are alpha and beta fructose, alpha and beta glucose. Let's understand this with the help of structure. So this is your alpha glucose. You can see this is carbon 1. Okay, in carbon 1, the hydroxyl is below the plane. And in beta, you can see at carbon 1, the hydroxyl is above the plane. So there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl below or above the plane, and thus we have two different forms, that is alpha glucose and beta glucose. So in alpha, when the hydroxyl at carbon 1 is below the plane, it is referred to as alpha orientation or alpha form. And in beta, the hydroxyl at carbon 1 is above the plane. Now let's talk about mutarotation. Mutarotation, it is the property of anomeric carbon, that is C1. Change in rotation of plane. In mutarotation, there is change in rotation of plane polarized light with time. So with time, you can notice a change in the rotation of plane polarized light. So alpha glucose has a mutarotation of 112 degrees and beta glucose has mutarotation of 19 degrees. Whereas at equilibrium, there is net rotation of 52 degrees. So what is happening initially, if the alpha form is high, then the rotation is at 112 degrees. Or if the beta form is high initially, then it is 19 degrees. And once the equilibrium is reached, then the rotation is 52 degrees. So this means that there is change in the rotation of plane polarized light with time, which is known as mutarotation. And why is this happening? This is happening because of because of interconversion of alpha and beta forms. Your This reaction is reversible, okay? So alpha can change into beta and your beta can change into alpha. So if initially alpha was high, then the rotation will be at 112 degree. Or if initially beta was high, then rotation will be 19 degrees. And if when equilibrium is reached, rotation will be 52 degrees. So we say that there is change, this change in rotation of plane polarized light with time. This is what is known as mutarotation. And this is happening due to interconversion of alpha and beta forms. What is racemic mixture? It is an equimolar mixture of optical isomers so that net rotation is 0. Epimers, isomerism at single carbon atom other than the functional and the penultimate carbon, then they are known as epimers. Okay, so if there is difference in orientation only at a single carbon, let's say at C2, then you end up with glucose and mannose. So we say glucose and mannose are epimers at carbon 2. Glucose and allose, there are epimers at carbon 3, and glucose and galactose, they are epimers at carbon 4. Remember, we talk about glucosamine and galactosamine in GAGs, and we said that there are epimers at glucose at carbon 4. Let's see what we mean by that. This is your glucose, this is your mannose, and we've just said that glucose and mannose, there are epimers at carbon 2. That is, there will be difference in orientation only at carbon 2. So this is your carbon 2, and there is difference in orientation only at a single carbon. So you can see at carbon 2, the orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen is different. But at rest of the carbons, you can see orientation is same. So we say glucose and mannose, they are epimers at carbon 2. And at epimers, there is isomerism only at single carbon, okay? Only at single carbon, don't get confused. You can see there is only difference in orientation at carbon 2 and rest, the orientation of rest of the hydrogen and hydroxyl is exactly same. Let's talk about glucose and galactose. So this is your glucose and this is your galactose. So in glucose and galactose, see it says there is difference in orientation at carbon 4. So this is your carbon 4. You can see there is difference in orientation at carbon 4. In glucose, the hydroxyl is on the right, and in galactose, the hydroxyl is on the left. Whereas at other carbons, you can see the orientation is exactly the same. So epimers are when there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen only at a single carbon. Whereas what are diastereomers, they differ in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen at more than one carbon. Okay. So when there is difference in orientation at more than one carbon and other than the penultimate and the anomeric carbon, then they are known as diastereomers, and these are not mirror images of each other. For example, mannose and galactose. Now see, this is galactose and this is mannose. Now compare the two structures. There is difference in orientation at carbon 2 as well as at carbon 4. So there is difference in orientation at two carbons. Okay. Here at carbon 2 and also at carbon 4. See. So your mannose and galactose, they become diastereomers. Now optical isomerism, it is the ability to rotate plane polarized light. Now rightward or clockwise rotation, it is known as dextrorotation, and leftward or anti-clockwise rotation, it is levorrotation. The glucose is dextrorotatory and fructose is levorrotatory. What does it mean? Let's say we take a test tube and we have glucose solution in this. And you pass plain polarized light through it. So what will happen? We are saying that your glucose is dextrorotatory. So you're passing plain polarized light through it. So what will happen after passing? It will be rotated clockwise or rightward. So this is dextrorotation. Now, another thing about, let's talk about invert sugar. You must have heard about this. So your sucrose, it is made up of glucose and fructose. So let's suppose we take a test tube, and in this test tube we have sucrose and we pass plain polarized light. So this is sucrose solution in the test tube. We pass plain polarized light. Okay, so what will happen? There will be clockwise rotation of the plane polarized light, dextrorotatory. But after some time, we will see that there is change in rotation. The plane polarized light is rotated in the anti-clockwise manner. Levo rotation takes place. Therefore, your sucrose is known as invert sugar because there is inversion of rotation of plain polarized light. Initially, there was dextro rotation, but later on, what happens? There is levo rotation. And why is this happening? Because your sucrose, it is a disaccharide made up of glucose and fructose. So initially, when the sucrose, the disaccharide was together, there was dextro rotation because of glucose. But upon hydrolysis, after some time, the glucose and the fructose they separate, and we can say that the levo rotation of fructose is more than the dextro rotation of glucose. So what is happening? Levo rotation is happening. So that was about isomerism. So with this, we come to the end of isomerism. Now let's talk about GAGs or glucosamminoglycans. If you have any queries, you can send them in the comments. Okay. So talking about GAGs or glycosaminoglycans as they are called, they are negatively charged heteropolysaccharide chains. Okay. So heteropolysaccharides we've already discussed in the chemistry of carbohydrates. So you know that heteropoly means many, saccharide means sugar. So many sugars, but many different sugars. Hetero, okay, and not same. So when many different sugars they are arranged together, they form glycosaminoglycans and they are negatively charged. From the name, we can understand that glyco is something to do with carbohydrate and amino is there, amino sugar, and glycan is another synonym for polysaccharide. So GAGs are also known as mucopolysaccharide as it was first seen in mucin and is abundantly present in mucin. So that was a brief introduction, not so important. Now talking about the structure of GAGs. You get asked about GAGs sometimes in short notes. So at least you should know the structure, types, and in types you should know that even if you don't know the disaccharide unit in the types, you should know that where they are present, their distribution is important even from MCQ point of view. Now talking about GAGs, they are long unbranched heteropolysaccharide with repeating disaccharide units. So what is happening in heteropolysaccharides, how are they formed? There is a certain disaccharide unit which is repeated, okay, to form this heteropolysaccharide which is known as GAG. Now what is that? Repeating disaccharide unit, it is made up of amino sugar and acidic sugar. What is an amino sugar? In amino sugar, as you can see here, it is formed by replacing the hydroxyl at carbon 2 with an amino group. You can see this is glucosamine and galactosamine. So in glucosamine, in glucose, the hydroxyl at carbon 2 has been replaced with amino group. And in galactosamine, the hydroxyl at carbon 2 has also been replaced with amino. So these are amino sugars. So what are the two amino sugars that are present in GAGs? That is glucosamine and galactosamine. And glucose and galactose, we've just spoken about it, that there are epimers at C4. That is, there is difference in orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen. Different orientation. Okay. An acidic sugar, it is formed when the carbon 6 has been oxidized to COH. We've already spoken about this as well. That is oxidation of the carbohydrates. So on carbohydrate oxidation, that is full oxidation, half oxidation. So you end up with glucuronic acid and iduronic acid. See, this carbon 6, it has been oxidized to COH group. So you end up with glucuronic acid and glucuronic acid. Your COH group is above the plane and iduronic acid, it is below the plane. So what are the disaccharide units now? The disaccharide unit is made up of amino sugar and acidic sugar. The amino sugar, it can either be glucosamine or galactosamine, and the acidic sugar can either be glucuronic acid and iduronic acid. And also, usually, the amino sugar is acetylated. That is, at the amino, that is NH2 that has been attached, usually an acetyl group is attached. Talking about the properties of GAD, it is negatively charged. Why? Because it has carboxyl groups that are attached to it. So it gives it a negative charge at physiological pH, and the amino sugar which are acetylated or sulfated, they also give it a negative charge. So the negative charge on GAGs is owing due to the carboxyl group present and the acetyl or the sulfates that are present. Now the GAGs repel each other because of the accumulating negative charges. Just like the poles of a magnet, that is the like poles repel, the negative charges, they repel each other. So when a lot of negative charges there in gas, there will be repulsion. So they slip past each other when brought together. This gives it the slippery consistency of mucus secretions and synovial fluid as they are rich in gas. So we all know that mucus and everything, it is very slippery. So this reason being that they are very rich in gas, and gas being negatively charged, so the charges they repel each other when they are brought together close to each other. Now, gas are negatively charged, therefore they attract water and thus are a very good at absorbing water. When the water is squeezed out, they occupy a smaller volume, and when compression is released, they go back to the original hydrated volume because of repulsion of negative charges. So, what is it saying? That your gas, they are negatively charged, and because of that negative charge, they're able to attract water molecules to itself. Now, because of this, they are good at absorbing water. But when there is some compression force applied, what will happen? That the hydration is lost, and they occupy a small volume. The water is squeezed out and they end up occupying a smaller volume. But when that compression is released, they go back to their original hydrated volume. And this property of gas is known as compressibility or resilience. Gas is resilient, therefore seen in synovial fluid and vitreous humor. Let's understand this better with the help of a diagram. You see, this is your gas, and it has attracted and absorbed all water molecules. But when it has been compressed, some compression force has been applied, what happens? The water moves out and it tends to occupy a very small volume. But on removal of this compression, it goes back to its original form by reabsorbing water. You can see. So this is also one of the properties of gas. Now moving on to the classification of gas, which is based on the repeating disaccharide unit, types of glycosidic linkages, and degree and location of sulfate units. So the six major GAGs, they are chondroitin, 4 and 6 sulfates. So for your exams, if you get a short note on GAGs, you should know the basic structure. That is, it is made up of amino and acidic sugar, and what are those amino and acidic sugars? Then you should talk briefly about the properties of that and types. In types, at least you should name the six major types along with the distribution. Okay, so this is like the bare minimum. Even if you're not able to memorize, like the disaccharide unit is an acetyl galactosamine with sulfate in either C4 and C6 and glucuronic acid, it's fine. But if you're able to learn like your chondroitin sulfates, they have galactosamine, at least galactosamine and glucuronic acid, then also it's fine. Otherwise, also it will do. But what you should know is that they are the most abundant GAG. Okay, this can form an MCQ question, that which of the following is the most abundant GAG. Now they are found in cartilages, tendons, bones, and aorta. Keratin sulfate, the disaccharide unit being N-acetyl glucosamine and galactosamine. The sulfate content is variable and may be present in carbon 6 of either sugar. Now, there are two types of keratin sulfate. Keratin sulfate 1 and 2. The 1 is found in cornea and the 2 is found in loose connective tissue. So, dermatan sulfate, the disaccharide unit in dermatan sulfate is N-acetyl galactosamine and L-iduronic acid. It is found in skin, blood vessels, and heart valves. Now, heparin, this is important. Disaccharide unit being glucosamine and glucuronic or iduronic acid. Most of the glucosamine residues are sulfated. Sulfate is also found as C3 or C6 of glucosamine and C2O uronic acid. Now, very important, this is the only intracellular gag. Other gags are present in extracellular compounds. So this is important that this is the only intracellular gags. So you might be asked that which of the following is an intracellular gag? Your answer will be heparin. Now it is present inside mast cells that line arteries. Also, it is an anticoagulant. I'm sure all of you know about this role of heparin, that it is an anticoagulant. Okay. Now, heparin sulfate. Is this the same as heparin except some glucosamines are acylated and there are fewer sulfate groups. So that is the only difference between heparin and heparin sulfate. Now, this is an extracellular gag found in basement membrane. And when we'll be studying about lipoproteins, we'll come across heparin sulfate once again in anchorage. Okay, so remember this. Now, talking about hyaluronic acid, must have heard of these names by dermats these days. Very good for your skin. Okay, disaccharide unit is N-acetyl glucosamine and glucuronic acid. All gags except for hyaluronic acid are sulfated. So this is the only unsulfated gag. Okay, now this is very important. So the only unsulfated gag is hyaluronic acid, not covalently attached to protein and only gag not limited to animal tissue. So it is also found in bacteria. Serves as a lubricant and shock absorber found in synovial fluid of joints, vitreous humor of the eye, the umbilical cord, and loose connective tissue and cartilage. So about hyaluronic acid, you need to remember that it is the only unsulfated gag. It is also found in bacteria and it serves as a shock absorbent and lubricant, and it is found in synovial fluids of joints. Now about heparin sulfate, you need to know that it is found in basement membrane. And heparin, that it is the only intracellular gag present inside mast cells and it is also an anticoagulant. And for dermatan sulfate, you need to know its distribution, that it is found in skin, blood vessels, and heart valves. And your keratin sulfates, they are found in cornea and loose connective tissue. And the most abundant gag is your chondroitin sulfates. So that was briefly about gag. Moving on to proteoglycans. Found in the ECM and outer surface of the cell, there is a central core protein to which 100 linear chains of gags are covalently attached. These chains may be composed of approximately 200 disaccharide units. So it's saying that, let's suppose this is the central core protein. Now to this central core protein, approximately 100 linear chains of gags are attached to this core protein. And each of those gags that are attached, they are approximately 200 disaccharides unit long. Now the linkage between the protein and the carbohydrate chain is through a trihexoside. So how are those gags attached to that central core protein? It is through a trihexoside, that is galactose, galactose, xylose, and a serine residue respectively. So an O-glycosidic bond is formed between xylose and hydroxyl of serine. We know that serines are hydroxyl containing amino acid. So the hydroxyl of the serine forms an O-glycosidic bond with the xylose. And what are glycosidic bonds? They are bonds between carbohydrates, okay? So it gives it a bottle brush shape. The gags are erect, extending out from the core protein as they repel from each other due to negative charges. Now, proteoglycans, the protein contains
Ma'am, camera turned off. Yeah, okay, ma'am. And ma'am, voice is also little bit low, ma'am. Audio.
yeah.
Ah, okay, ma'am. Shall we start, ma'am?
Yeah. Okay. So I think we lost connection. So we're talking about proteoglycans. So this is what your proteoglycan structure looks like. So there is this core protein you can see. To this core protein, approximately 100 gags are attached, and each gag has approximately 200 disaccharide unit. Okay, and how is this attachment taking place? It is between the hydroxyl of a serine, this hydroxyl of a serine and xylose. Okay, and this linkage region is known as trihexoid region, which has xylose, galactose, and galactose. And then you have the repeating disaccharides unit. Okay, so I was asking about if the protein content is less, that is 5%, and the GAG is 95%, it is known as proteoglycans. But if it is reversal, your carbohydrate content is 5% and protein content is 95%, it is known as glycoprotein. A very important example of glycoprotein, can you tell me any? Yeah, it is antibodies. Okay, your antibodies are glycoproteins. So this is how your proteoglycans look like, giving it a brush bottle appearance. The core protein, and from the core protein, the gags are sticking out as you can see and repelling each other erect because of the negative charges that they have. Now, synthesis of gags, it occurs in endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus. Degradation takes place in lysosome. Now, this is important. Degradation of GAGs takes place in the lysosome, and defect in degradation of GAG constitutes a particular group of disorder known as mucopolysaccharidosis. Now, this is the clinical of GAG, and this is important, mucopolysaccharidosis. So, let's talk briefly about mucopolysaccharidosis. So these mucopolysaccharidosis, they are hereditary diseases caused by a deficiency in any one of the lysosomal hydrolases involved in the degradation of GAGs. So your mucopolysaccharides, they are hydrolyzed in lysosome. And if there is deficiency of any of the lysosomal hydrolases which are involved in the degradation of these mucopolysaccharidases, mucopolysaccharides, it leads to what is known as mucopolysaccharidosis. So basically, what is mucopolysaccharidosis? It is a defect in the degradation of GAGs in the lysosome. So what will happen because of this? It will lead to intralysosomal accumulation of GAGs. That is, inside the lysosome, your GAGs will start accumulating in various tissues, causing a range of symptoms. So all your mucopolysaccharidosis are autosomal recessive disorders, the hereditary autosomal recessive disorders, except for Hunter syndrome, which is X-linked. So two important mucopolysaccharidoses are your Hunters and Hurlers. Okay, so we'll be talking about, although there are others as well, but these are the two most important ones, so we'll be taking them up. The enzyme deficiency is alpha L iduronidase deficiency. So this leads to accumulation of heparan sulfate and dermatan sulfate. Clinical features include corneal clouding, developmental delay, dwarfing, poor spatial features, upper airway obstruction, hearing loss. There is deposition in coronary artery and leads to ischemia and early death. So, treatment includes enzyme replacement therapy. And Hunter's syndrome, the enzyme deficiency is iduronate sulfatase deficiency. Degradation of dermatan sulfate and heparin sulfate is affected. This is X-linked recessive disorder. So this is important. You should know that this Hunter is an exception. It is an X-linked disorder, whereas the others are autosomal recessive disorders. So in an MCQ, you can be asked like which of the following mucopolysaccharidosis is X-linked. So if you do not know about this exception that Hunters, you might be like all of them are autosomal recessive disorders. Okay. So your answer will be Hunters, which is X-linked. Therefore, only males are affected. A clear vision as there is no corneal clouding. So this is a point of difference between Hunter and Hurlers. In Hunters, there is clear vision and there is no corneal clouding, whereas in Hurlers, corneal clouding is present. And treatment includes enzyme replacement therapy. So today we come to the end of our marathon series on carbohydrate unit. So we've entirely finished this unit. So if you have any queries, you can ask. Yeah. So all of the topics for carbohydrates, the cycles, the chemistry, isomerism, GAGs, and leucopolysaccharidosis. All of this has been completed. So with this, we come to the end of our marathon series in carbohydrates. And tomorrow we'll be continuing again with our lipid series. So if you have any queries, you can ask. Thank you for watching.